you do some of that for us to kind of tell us some of the highlights of your career, and so we can put Celia into context?
You going to tape all this as I do it?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Well, let's begin early years. I'm a native St. Louisan. I'm going to have a birthday soon. And I'm proud to tell you that I'm going to be 89 years old, which I find kind of fascinating. My parents are, of course, mainly responsible for who I am and what I am. So I want to talk about them for a moment.
Yes,
my mother was a native-born St. Louisan as well, from a family in South St. Louis, where she was born. And my father was a proud Texan. And he spent the first part of his career as a railway mail clerk on the run from Texas to Missouri. And when he had a layover in Missouri, one of the ways in which young men like him found recreation was to take a boat ride on the Mississippi. And one day my mother was on that same boat. And he began his pursuit. And they finally married. I'm a middle child. And I must say that I had a sense that my father favored my brother. And I was always trying to get his attention, as it were. But he was, I'm afraid he was a male chauvinist. I think he would have preferred all boys. But at any rate, we had one son and two girls. Even though I grew up in a segregated society here in St. Louis, I was reared in a very gracious, lovely setting, because my father, even before he married my mother, had purchased an 11-room home there. And that's where I was born. On Côte Brilliant, which is in a section of St. Louis which we know as the Ville. And when I was a little girl, the Ville was a very thriving, lively community. And that's where I grew up. A very happy, pleasant childhood. And then as my father moved toward the end of his career with the Railway Mail Service, he entered the real estate business. And I think he was among the early real estate brokers who were African Americans in this city, and did very, very well. So that by the time we moved, I guess you'd say up, to Enright Avenue, in a 13-room house on the 4100 block on Enright, I was not conscious of it, but I realize now that my parents were very comfortably well off in those days. My mother had a car and a chauffeur, and there were children made for us and a housekeeper. So we were, you know, I think affluent by anybody's standards. Well, went to Marshall grade school, graduated from Sumner High School, and did my college work at Talladega College, which was a wonderful experience. My senior year there, to my astonishment, I was given a travel study fellowship along with a young woman from Fisk University, Betty McCree, and we were given a trip around the world, a 6-month study in India. It was quite fabulous. And we traveled alone. That is, between stops. People met us at every stop, but we literally left from New York, London, Paris, Marseille, down the Mediterranean to Athens, across over to Port Said and down into Cairo, back up and through the Suez, around down to Colombo, up to India, and then back around. So we came back by way of San Francisco and Hawaii. We were both 20 years old. So we really were minors, by the laws, and it only caught up with us once. We were supposed to get a visa in Paris to travel into Egypt. They didn't have time to get the visa before we left, so we were told to go to the Egyptian consulate in Paris and get our visa. And we chilled in there and said who we were. And he was very gracious, and he was filling out the papers. He said, "Now, how old are you ladies?" And we both said, "We're 20. He said, "What? You're not 21? And we said, "No." "Oh, but you can't go to Egypt. We got blah, 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 blah." He went into a fit. Because we were minors as far as he was concerned. And we were sort of astonished, being Americans. And he said, "Well, the only way I've considered is if you get permission from your American consul for you to be traveling alone and going to Egypt," which our American consul gave us with no problem. But it was a wonderful experience. I came back to Talladega to finish my senior year, graduated cum laude, major in economics, minor in mathematics, and came home with not the faintest idea what I wanted to do with my life. But I knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be a teacher, I didn't want to be a social worker, I didn't want to be a nurse. And now I realized I was pushing away from all those things that were considered female, And that's where this fate stepped in. I had a friend from high school named Dorothy Freeman, who was a polio victim, and she showed up at my house that summer after I graduated. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Well, what are you going to be doing?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, why don't you go to law school? Everybody can use a little law." And I said, "Law school?" It had not crossed my mind. But you have to know that this was a period when education was separate for African Americans and others. And rather than let Lloyd Gaines attend the law school in Columbia, the state of Missouri set up a separate law school so he could go to law school in Paul College in St. Louis. And it's incredible if you think about it now, but back then it was the way things were solved. We were going to be separate no matter what, and the state was willing to pay for it. So they created a law school out of whole cloth, and this was a school that Dorothy was inviting me to attend. I realized she was recruiting. And I was very cavalier. I said, "Well, I'll go and talk to the dean." She said, "You go and talk to the dean and see what you can work out." And she said, "I'll make an appointment for you." And she did, and I did. And I can remember to this day, as I sat down in front of the dean, my first words to him, "I'll consider going to your law school if you will give me a scholarship which will pay for my tuition and fees, and a part-time job which will pay for my books and spending money." That was my deal. Well, I was living at home, so I had room and board. And he looked at me for a long time. And then he said, "Young lady, if you have enough nerve to ask me, I have enough nerve to give it to you." And that's how I started. I didn't know a thing about law school. I didn't know any, But I went to class for 1 week, discovered I had stumbled on my calling. I loved it. And I think it was because in law school you have case books, not textbooks. So no matter how boring you can always say to yourself, this happened to somebody. You know, the books are organized by cases and subject matter. And so I went sailing through 3 years of law. Loved every minute of it. And in my senior year, third year, we were in the midst of World War II. And many of my classmates who were male were being drafted. It was all-out war. The bar examiners, in their great wisdom, decided that they would let members of the senior classes in the law school take the bar exam before they left to go to war. And so I was in that senior class, and I had the audacity to say, well, I'll go take it too. So, which I did. And the dean had told me not to go. So if I had flunked that, it would have just been off. But I didn't flunk, I passed. So I was really a member of the bar before I got my degree. But here we are. And that kind of brings you up historically, who and what I am.
Hardly. There are lots of things that happened after that.
Absolutely.
And so maybe we can talk about those later.
Yeah.
But you met a young lady while you were in law school, is that correct? By the name of Celia. Can you tell us about Celia?
Yes. Very interesting story. I was in the library at law school doing some research on another case. And I came across a citation which said, "In re Celia, a slave," with a case number. And I sat up and I said, I wonder what that's about. So then I wrote it down. And later on, I found the case and read it. It's in the books. It's in the case books. And I suddenly could not believe what I'd read. She was this young, very young slave girl. I've forgotten how old she was, but my recollection is that she's much younger than I was then. And she was the slave of an owner somewhere in Missouri. And from the case itself, you learned that she had had children by this owner, was pregnant with another child of his, very sick. It wasn't an easy pregnancy, and he came down to her cabin to have his way with her, and she would have none of it. She was just very, very unwilling. And when he insisted, the story is that she picked up some kind of a log or something, hit him over the head, and did him in. And then sat there for an hour or so pondering this tragedy. And she couldn't have been, she must have been in her teens. It's difficult for me to understand thinking about how this could happen to anybody. And this is why I was so astounded by this. And then she looked at the fireplace and decided she would just push him in the fireplace. And that's what she did. Now that's the story that I gathered from. And my impression is, just from reading it, that if she had not said a word to anybody, they probably would never have known what happened. But she told one of the other slaves, and that was her undoing, because that person then told one of the master's family members, and then they began to questioned Celia at length, went down to her cabin, and then searched that fireplace and found buttons from her master's coat. And that's what led to her conviction for murder and her execution. Well, to this day, I have, after reading that case and its outcome, I have not been able to leave Celia, nor has she been able to leave me. Because I tried to imagine what it must have been like for a young girl, 16, 17 years old, to live in an environment where she had no control, where people could misuse her and she had no redress. It must have been a nightmare. And so I concluded, after reading this and really understanding what slavery was like, one aspect of it, that nothing that could happen to me could compare with what she endured. And then she was my heroine. And I've loved her ever since.
That is a powerful story.
It is a powerful story, and it is symptomatic of a very sick, serious time in the history of this country. And I don't really think enough of my generation, those, appreciate what a devastating, completely irrational and unwholesome system slavery was. You were people who had absolutely no rights. And what we have to face realistically is that this was the norm. Almost every president of the United States, starting with George Washington, had slaves. These were people whom they controlled. Thomas Jefferson had slaves. It was an incredible system where a group of people had absolutely no rights and who were at the whim of others.
Yet, in the story of Celia, some 15 years, 17 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, she was given a trial.
Yep.
Having killed her slave master.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the circumstances that brought about that murder
Right.
were probably not rare. I'm sure that there are many women who were abused in the name of slavery. And but I think that Celia is all of our hero, our heroine for many people, for the actions that she took. But how rare it must have been for a slave to actually get a trial.
Which was the anomaly of it all. They actually, call themselves giving her due process. She had absolutely no rights. Otherwise, this couldn't have happened at all. But now that it's happened, we're going to give her a due process. And so they went through the formality of a trial, and we had a lawyer appointed. And my recollection is that it was a jury trial. And the jury found her guilty of murder and sentenced her to hang. And that's what happened to her. She was pregnant at the time. And as I remember, they postponed the execution until after the birth of her child. So there was a living child from this encounter. and then they hanged her. It's an almost unbelievable story nowadays. How could this happen? But it did. And it is a time and a period in the history of this country of which we cannot be proud.
Since the time that you've met Celia, she's become, and her story has become, a pretty popular case for study in most law schools in the nation. And there seems to be a resurgence of this trial now, especially in Missouri and around the Fulton area. What do you think has brought about this renewed interest in Celia?
Well, I think one of the things that's happening in this country, and I think it's for the good, is that we're facing what is our real history, honestly. And this is a manifestation of it. There are people, both African American and Caucasian, who are willing to confront what happened in this country honestly. You know, I'm always amazed that some of my Caucasian acquaintances who talk about, we built this country, but they don't include us in it. They talk as if this was built by Caucasians. This country was built on the land of the Indians, which they took, and the backs of Africans whom they enslaved for 300 years. That's how this country was built. And if I had free land and free labor, I could do pretty good too. It's not available now, but that's what this country had. Free land and free labor for 300 years. And they got their foot in the door of international trade on 3 crops: cotton, sugar, and tobacco. And you and I know who picked the cotton. And what do you do with tobacco? Chop it? You know? Slave labor, Indian land. So we're as much a part of the warp and woof of this country as everybody else is, except that only a certain group have benefited almost entirely until, what, the 18th, 19th century.
Could it be that the discussion of Celia is an effort to sort of reconcile some of the sins of our past? How do we as a whole begin to move beyond a past that we've tried to cover up and begin to heal and move forward?
I think that's the importance of Celia. This opens a door that has been closed in terms of communication, discussion, acknowledgement. And I think it's extremely important that just in the case of the history and story of Celia, the family, the white family, the Newsomes, some of whom did not know this story because it was not passed down to them. It was hidden from them. They're now discovering it. And they are beginning to reach out to people in the black community who have known about it and are somehow communicating. And that will help. I think we have to face our shortcomings and then close ranks and move on.
That's beautiful. What I'd like to do is to kind of switch speeds a little bit and talk a little bit about the process. I understand you commissioned Solomon Thurman to paint a portrait.
Celia worried me for a while, you know. I just couldn't get her out of my system. And I ran into Solomon one day and I said to Solomon, how come, could you paint me a picture of Celia? And to my astonishment, he said, yes. And I said, well, how will you do it? He said, well, you know, we'll get the story, and I'll imagine it, and I'll paint it. I said, you got it. And it took him a while, because I wouldn't. He would bring me these examples, and I said, nope, that's not Celia. I mean, I didn't really know what she looked like, but I knew what I wanted to see in a portrait of her. And I think Solomon got really kind of sick of me, because I kept rejecting these images that he brought. And then finally one day, he brought this present portrait, and it was her eyes. If you look at this portrait, you will see in her eyes all of the suffering, all of the trauma, all of the pain of what she went through. And I said, that's it, Solomon. And then he finished it off, and it's been a wonderful inspiration for me, because nothing that can happen to me, nothing could compare with what that young woman suffered. And so I just hold my head up and go on. She's a wonderful, wonderful heroine for me, because I don't know, the whole notion of what she went through is just mind-boggling. She had no rights. She had none. And that is a terrible thing. When you have no protection against being abused, and then when you try to protect yourself, you end up being executed for murder. Heavy duty. Can't imagine it.
Well, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. Anything else that we should know about Celia as we reflect upon her life?
Well, she has some descendants, we think. And there are some descendants of the Newsom family. And it's very interesting, but there is some communication now being discussed and considered of having these two sides meet and interact, and perhaps some healing about this whole tragic story. I just learned recently that there are some members of the Newsom family who never heard the story until recently. They did not know this ever happened. And it's been a shock for them. On Celia's side, her child lived and was ultimately married to someone else, and we've been able to get in touch with them. So descendants of Celia are still around. And I think it's encouraging that there is a movement gently and calmly to bring these two together for what I hope will be a great healing experience, so that both sides can understand that to be humane and to be decent and to be sensitive to the feelings of others has not been lost. And perhaps we'll all be the better for that.
Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.